This, American says, is one of the planes that crashed into one of the World Trade Center buildings. United Flight 175 Dulles to Los Angeles was hijacked. United Flight 93 Newark to San Francisco was hijacked. Those are the flights. If you have questions about this and you need to contact one of the airlines if you're concerned about passengers on these flights. This now back to live picture. Police say casualties could number in the thousands. Let us take you back now. We're going to show you on videotape the key sequence of events. This, again, is not a graphic. This is an actual photograph of the plane crashing into one of the World Trade Center towers. Flames shoot out of the opposite side of the building. And then, a short while later, one of the towers began collapsing. The hope, the prayer was it was only part of the building collapsing, but it turned out to be the whole building comes down. Raining debris in a wide area below it. And this harsh fact we had only had time to absorb it when the second tower began to collapse. First one plane hit a World Trade Center tower, then another plane hit the other tower. One tower collapses and the other collapses. Carol Marine, our CBS News correspondent based in Chicago, is just back from this part of New York City. Carol?
Dan, I think I was in the second collapse or an explosion right after that, because I was trying to make my way around Stuyvesant High School. I believe that's correct. I'm not a New Yorker. But I was coming toward the World Trade Center looking for CBS crews and asked a firefighter if he saw any. He told me to walk down the middle of the road. All of a sudden, there was a roll, an explosion, and we could see coming at us a ball of flame stories high. He and others screamed, "Run," and I ran. I fell. One of them picked me up. We ran as fast as we could, and then he threw me into the wall of a building and covered me. Forgive me. I am in his debt. You know, Dan, I know firefighters do incredible work all of the time, but this was exceeded anything that I can imagine. He threw me into a wall, covered me with his body. I could feel his heart banging against my back. We were both so sure we were going to die. The flame somehow stopped short of us. But whatever collapsed created, and you saw it in some of that video, Dan, a rain of cinders so thick that you couldn't see this far in front of you and you couldn't breathe. A police officer, and I wish I knew the firefighter's name, a police officer by the name of Brendan Duke grabbed my hand, and he and I tried to find our way through it until we could hit a clearing in the light. What you're seeing on the ground here, Dan, was in the air, and you couldn't see. And again, we thought we were finished. We somehow got to the light. Another firefighter gave me his mask for a moment so I could breathe. And then I made my way somehow through the smoke into the light to our crews. There was a cameraman there whose head was bloody, and he was trying to shoot and set up some of these shots there. The firefighters, the police, the crews, the people streamed toward me as I made my way to the Trade Center, sobbing and crying and trying to call home on dead cell phones, but they couldn't get through. There is so much fear out there even now because of gas main leaks. There was a point at which I watched firefighters run. Someone threw me forward. A paramedic truck let me jump inside and drove me halfway, and then a New York City bus driver opened his doors of an empty bus and drove me here to the broadcast center. To all of them, I mean, citizens of New York and have remained amazingly calm but deeply frightened.
CBS News correspondent Carol Marine, still covered with the smoke and pieces of the debris. Stick with us here, Carol. I want to repeat that New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani now says, and this is a direct quote, There have been a tremendous number of lives lost. Certainly no one at this early hour can know how many lives have been lost. But it's impossible to watch the pictures of both of the World Trade Centers collapsing. Keep in mind these buildings were 110 stories in height each, with 50,000 plus people generally working there on a weekday, which this of course is. So when the mayor of New York says there's been a tremendous number of lives lost, there's no question that it is true. Carol Maureen, did you see any bodies? Did you see anyone that you said to yourself, that person is dead?
I saw people on stretchers that I was certain were dead. I saw firefighters and paramedics going into buildings where they themselves had to wonder if they were coming out. But there were a surprising number of people ambulatory and making their way out. I saw much more of that than I saw actual carnage. The concern that I heard from police and fire was that the people who were dead didn't make their way out of those towers, that most of the death is contained within those buildings.
And perhaps some people still alive inside the building. That frequently happens when by earthquake or something else there's been a collapse such as this. But mark it, this is unprecedented. There has never been anything like this. The twin towers of the World Trade Centers collapsing, 4 airplanes hijacked within the space of an hour and a half or 2 hours, an apparent attack by air, plane crashing near Camp David. Details on that are still sketchy, and there's some question as to if a plane crashed there, how close it actually got to Camp David. President Bush on his way, presumably back to Washington. The White House has air fighter cover and has had such since the first reports of the World Trade Center attacks. President Bush says it's an apparent terrorist attack. It's clear that one of the suspects in this is the worldwide, what has been described as the worldwide terrorist network of Osama bin Laden. However, let us mark well that nobody knows who's responsible for these apparently coordinated attacks on selected targets in America today. That out of London, a Saudi dissident who is connected with Osama bin Laden pointed out today, this is Mr. Abdel Bari Atwan, editor of a London-based Arabic newspaper, said, and I quote him, Islamic fundamentalists led by bin Laden were, quote, almost certainly behind the attack on the World Trade Center in New York. This is this one man's opinion. This man, who is well connected with Osama bin Laden, says it is most likely the work of Islamic fundamentalists. Osama bin Laden warned 3 weeks ago that he would attack American interests in an unprecedented attack, a very big one. Atwan told Reuters, and he said that he personally received information that Osama bin Laden was planning very, very big attacks against American interests, unquote. Now, those are the quotes of one man in London. We want to underscore, italicize, put in all caps, nobody knows who's responsible for these attacks. Osama bin Laden gets blamed for almost everything in the way of this kind of attack around the world. There's been considerable controversy and debate in the upper reaches of Western diplomacy and intelligence agencies about whether he alone is capable of pulling off these kinds of attacks. But all of that will be for later to sort out. Clearly, someone had coordinated attacks on these selected targets. Byron Pitts, our CBS News correspondent, is on the telephone from the tip of Manhattan. Byron.
Dan, we're about 3 blocks away from where the planes crashed into the buildings. Joining me now is a security officer in the World Financial Center who was there when the first plane struck the building. Sir, what can you tell us?
Okay, all I can tell you is that roughly at about 10 minutes to 9, I was in the lobby of one of the buildings of the World Financial Center when I heard a rumble. I went outside. I saw the first plane strike the side of the building. There was a lull. A fire started in the top of the World Trade Center building, and then about 5 minutes later, a second plane struck. Debris everywhere. People jumping out of windows of the World Trade Center trying to save themselves, literally jumping to their deaths.
Did you have the opportunity at all to evacuate some of the floors in the building you were in?
Yes, we did. Quick thinking of our forces there decided to get everybody out as quick as possible after the first plane struck. That little lull period before the second one came helped us greatly in getting thousands of people out of one of our buildings.
Did you actually see the plane strike the building?
I saw the second plane strike the side of the building because I was outside evacuating employees from our building at that time. That was when we witnessed people jump into their deaths literally from the side of the World Trade Center building while it was engulfed in flames.
You were saying you've been near the scene recently. What was the situation there?
The situation there was that about 15 to 20 minutes later, the structure that was remaining of the World Trade Center buildings caved in and fell straight to the ground, literally covering everybody that was within a quarter-mile radius of that building, myself included. Was stuck in the lobby area until the fire department came and got me out.
You were saying that I've heard you on the radio talking to some of your colleagues. What's the latest information you're getting from the scene?
The latest information right now is that we have major gas leaks in that area, and they're making the area totally sterile around the World Trade Center and the World Financial Center area due to these gas leaks, because we've been having many
actually happened here and what they still don't understand. And what they do know has happened is, of course, 3 separate terrorist attacks in the United States, the World Trade Center, at the Pentagon, and some event that has occurred in Pennsylvania, including that affected a commercial airliner. Because of the proximity of that crash of the commercial airline in Pennsylvania to Camp David, there is a presumption by some in law enforcement that Camp David may have been the target of that attack. That, of course, was a hijacked commercial aircraft that we are told did not respond to repeated attempts to communicate with it either by the military or the FAA. Now, other things that the government is confirming at this hour. Number one, they received no warnings. They had no hint of any attack against domestic targets in the United States. Number two, they have not received any claim for any of these attacks from anyone. And number three, although they have no evidence that this is the case, they are assuming and presuming that there could be additional attacks within the United States and are reacting appropriately. To do so, they have set up command posts, we are told, in Washington, in Phoenix, and in Los Angeles. Moments ago, the Attorney General of the United States returned from out of town. He was taken by an armored car convoy to the FBI headquarters. Would you ask him, please? Excuse me, Dan, we have a little bit of confusion here in our newsroom at the moment. I can also say that the intelligence community is now saying officially that they do believe that these attacks have the signature, as one official put it, of the Al-Qaeda organization. That, of course, is the terrorist organization that is under the control of Osama bin Laden. They said that is, quote, our lead theory. Dan?
Jim Stewart in Washington. Now at Barksdale Air Force Base in Shreveport, Louisiana, President Bush is about to come out. We believe this is live, although we've been told earlier that it'd be played on videotape. Here is the president. That the president flew from Florida, apparently to Barksdale Air Force Base outside Shreveport, Louisiana. We were told that he would appear, make a statement on videotape. Then we thought it was live. Now we're going to the videotape. We're having some difficulty, but here is the president, we hope, speaking on videotape from Barksdale Air Force Base in Shreveport. We're going to try again to show you the videotape of the president speaking here.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts. I've been in regular contact with the Vice President, Secretary of Defense, the National Security Team, and my cabinet. We have taken all appropriate security precautions to protect the American people. Our military at home and around the world is on high alert status, and we have taken the necessary security precautions to continue the functions of your government. We have been in touch with the leaders of Congress and with world leaders to assure them that we will do whatever is necessary to protect America and Americans. I ask the American people to join me in saying a thanks for all the folks who have been fighting hard to rescue our fellow citizens, and to join me in saying a prayer for the victims and their families. The resolve of our great nation is being tested, but make no mistake, we will show the world that we will pass this test. God bless.
President Bush on videotape from Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. Where the president is at this moment, we do not know. The president said freedom itself was attacked by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended. With us here at our CBS News World headquarters in New York is one of the world's outstanding experts on terrorism, Jerry Hauer, who's a former commissioner of the mayor's office here in New York City of emergency management. He's now a terrorist expert with Kroll Associates. Jerry Hauer, thanks for being with us.
Sure, Dan.
A lot of talk about rage and revenge. It's being said in Washington, this quote bears the signature of Osama bin Laden. What is the workaday American to think about what has happened in our country today?
Well, I think the first focus right now has to be on the victims and the families of this horrific event, and on the work of the rescue workers that both here and in Washington. Certainly our prayers go out to them, and we've seen just a devastating event today. At the same time, we have to recognize that this was a cowardly act. This was an attack on the United States. I'm sure that the good work of the FBI in time, they will track down. Certainly this has the signature of bin Laden, but I think it's premature to point fingers. I think that we need to let the FBI do their work and try and point the finger as time goes on. Right now, the focus has to be on the response here in New York and in Washington.
Well, let's talk about that. What is happening at the city, state, and federal level as we speak?
Well, clearly, as we've heard from the mayor, there's an enormous response. The New York City Fire Department, Police Department have mobilized every bit of manpower. They've recalled all firefighters, police officers back to work. There are hundreds and hundreds of police officers, firefighters, ambulances coming from around the state, from New Jersey. The governor has mobilized the National Guard to assist New York City, and there will be federal assets coming in, both from a law enforcement perspective to assist the New York office of the FBI, but more importantly to assist the response. FEMA urban search and rescue teams. A collapse of this magnitude that is still burning, more than likely as a result of both the jet fuel and the gas that was in the building. I've been told that there's a gas leak in the building from the natural gas lines that feed the building. This could burn for quite some time, could burn for hours or even days. The recovery from this will take months and years.
A couple of questions. First of all, if we can get it up on videotape, I want to show you as well as viewers, because we're additional people are coming in front of their sets as the day goes along. If we can get the videotape up of three key events this morning, and the question is whether the collapse, this is, and again, this is not a graphic, this is an actual picture of the plane coming into one of the World Trade Center towers, and then those flames shooting out the other side.
Right.
And then we'll follow on the videotape. This happened around 9 a.m. this morning.
Right.
And then not too long after that, in the 9 to 10 period, one of the towers began collapsing. We had hoped against hope it was partial collapsing. Some people leaped out of the building or were forced out by the flames and the explosion. They would gasp on the ground. My question is, we watch this first one tower collapse. That's what you're going to see on the videotape.
Right.
Then another tower collapse. Is this massive destruction of the World Trade Center, based on what you know, and I recognize we're dealing with so few facts, is it possible that just a plane crash could have collapsed these buildings, or would it have required the sort of prior positioning of other explosives in the building? What do you think?
No, my sense is that just the velocity of the plane and the fact that you have a plane filled with fuel hitting that building that burned, the velocity of the plane certainly had an impact on the structure itself. And then the fact that it burned and you had that intense heat probably weakened the structure as well. And I think it was simply the planes hitting the buildings and causing the collapse. You know, as you can see, the impact on the rescue workers. I mean, these people who are heroes in this building that have been impacted by this. The number of people that have been injured, the number of police and fire officers, firefighters that have been injured is just, it's incalculable at this point.
And the mayor said within the last hour, I think, that there were indications that some people might still be alive in the debris of the building. That's reasonable to accept that.
Oh, it's this early into an incident, you have to assume that some people are alive. I know that after all the years I've worked with the New York City Fire Department and Police Department, they will make every effort to do everything humanly possible to get in there to find any potential victims that might still be alive, recognizing that additional collapses of these buildings and the buildings, I'm told, in the area, there's a potential for a collapse of another building next door. They are going to do everything humanly possible to search that rubble.
Well, I'm recalling the terrible events when the federal building in Oklahoma City was, in effect, destroyed. It took days, and there were days, in fact, when people sniffing dogs, it's not an eloquent phrase, were brought into play. Is that scene, it seems to me, is very likely to be played on a greater scale in the days to come.
A much greater scale. When you've got, it took days and weeks to get through the Mura building. You've now got two buildings that have literally been destroyed. The biggest problem in going through and doing any kind of search and rescue at this point is the potential for additional collapse and the potential for putting additional people in jeopardy. And the New York City Fire Department, New York City Police Department will try and do rescues, but they will have to recognize, and it's a difficult call, that there could be additional collapses. This scene will play out, a search and rescue effort will play out over not days, but weeks, and body recovery could play out over a period of many, many weeks.
Let me pause and say the U.S. Federal Reserve says it is open and operating, the Federal Reserve, and its discount window will provide liquidity to financial markets as needed. That, of course, is to be reassuring to the financial markets in this country and around the world. Mika Brzezinski is on the telephone down in Lower Manhattan. I want to bring her in a moment, but just before I do so, we may want to come back to this a time or two. You know, you served as the commissioner for Mayor Giuliani's Office of Emergency Management. Were you privy to intelligence reports at any level at that time from federal intelligence agencies? And if so, what perspective can you give us? I mean, there have been these repeated reports that, well, yes, Osama bin Laden, but some think he's been overemphasized as responsible for these kinds of events. I know many intelligence people at very high levels who say, listen, you can't have these kinds of attacks without having some state, Iraq, Iran, Libya, Syria, somebody involved. Put that into perspective for us.
Well, I'm not sure I agree that this is necessarily state-sponsored. It, as I mentioned earlier, certainly has the fingerprints of somebody like bin Laden, but I think we have to wait and see. I think it's, you know, we saw during the during the Mura building bombing, everybody jumped to conclusions early on about who was responsible for that. I think it's very premature. I think that we certainly know that based on what's gone on around the world, what's gone on in the Mideast, that we have been on, that things have been very tense. I'm not aware at this point of any specific threats against New York City, but that's something that both the intelligence gathering organizations and the FBI will be looking at very closely in the days to come.
One of the most experienced intelligence people I know, a man who was responsible for tracking down terrorists, once said to me, revenge is best served cold. Mm-hmm. What he meant by that was that you can have your rage, but if it's a counterpunch you intend to take, better to have patience, wait, bide your time. Cried aloud as they saw one after another persons jumping or forced out of the building. There were secondary, then third explosions, and then a fourth explosion. Apparently no one knows for sure, from the high-octane fuel and other causes in the interior of the building brought about by the crash of the two planes into the World Trade Centers. 4 aircraft, commercial aircraft, were hijacked during the day. 2 of them crashed into the World Trade Center buildings. Another apparently crashed into the Pentagon, where there has been some loss of life, how much we do not know, and there have been some injuries. And then another plane is believed, this has never been completely, totally confirmed, in the area of Camp David, the presidential retreat in Camp David, Maryland. FBI officials reported earlier that a plane had crashed in that vicinity, but it's been a confused reporting situation about that since then. And then in western Pennsylvania, in the Pittsburgh area, there was a big plane crash there, details of which are still being sorted out. That was the crash in Somerset, Pennsylvania. So the North World Trade Center tower was hit, then the South Tower hit, both collapsed. Plane crashed at the Pentagon, plane crashed in Somerset County, Pennsylvania, and one may, I underscore the word, have crashed in the vicinity of Camp David, Maryland. This is perhaps the most audacious terrorist attack that's ever taken place in the world. The most audacious terrorist attack ever taken place in the world, according to Chris Yates, an aviation expert with Janes in London. And he said it takes a logistics operation from the terror group involved that is second to none. He went on to say that only a very small handful of terrorist groups is on that list, and he names at the top of the list Osama bin Laden. That's quote unquote for Mr. Yates. However, we keep emphasizing no one knows who's responsible for what happened today. And you may want to note that on previous occasions, first reports about who was responsible for what turned out to be erroneous. It will be many hours, perhaps days and weeks, before it can be sorted out who in fact is responsible for these actions today. John Roberts is at our Washington Bureau. John?
Well, Dan, let's first of all speak to the issue of whether there was or there was not any kind of a crash in the Camp David area. I spoke with Secret Service sources just a few minutes ago, Dan, who say that they have no evidence that there was any kind of a crash or an explosion or fire or anything near Camp David in the Catoctin Mountains of Maryland. They say that there was this aircraft that went down in the Pittsburgh area, which is still some distance from Camp David, but there was nothing, at least, probably I would think within a number of miles radius of Camp David, and nothing to suggest that Camp David may have been specifically targeted either. However, they do not know at this point where that aircraft that crashed in Pittsburgh was headed, whether it was indeed headed to Pittsburgh, whether it might have been trying to overfly the northern area of Maryland near Camp David. Perhaps it might have been headed for downtown Washington, D.C. as well, because there, of course, is that other aircraft that crashed into the Pentagon. And there appeared to be, at least from my perspective, Dan, upon arrival at the White House this morning, that when that aircraft went into the Pentagon, what had been a fairly mild state of alarm at the White House suddenly went to an enormously high state of alert. They evacuated the building within 5 minutes, and they cordoned off a number of blocks around the White House, not letting anyone back in. And as well, they evacuated the vice president and his staff. He is in charge of the Situation Room right now, off campus, not at the White House, though by all accounts still in Washington, D.C. He is there with his national security advisor and his chief of staff at his side. Lynn Cheney, his wife, also said to be in the same area as the vice president. But Dan, a development within the last 45 minutes that I certainly don't want to begin to appear to speculate on, but we understand, Dan, that the congressional leadership this morning, after the attacks, was taken from Capitol Hill. They were taken to a secure location for a while under the protection of the Capitol Hill police, and then they dispersed and were operating out of private offices. Well, CBS News has learned from congressional sources just recently that the leadership of Congress, the congressional leadership, has been gathered together and is being ferried by helicopter individually, not together, individually, to a location outside of Washington, D.C. Now, of course, the big area that has been designated for Congress to go to in the event of a big national emergency, war, nuclear attack, is Weather Mountain in the western part of Virginia, Dan, but we can't say that that's where they've been taken. President Bush, after leaving Sarasota, Florida today, went to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, where he made his first statement after receiving a full debriefing of what had taken place in New York and Washington. Here's what the president had to say.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts. I've been in regular contact with the Vice President, Secretary of Defense, the National Security Team, and my cabinet. We have taken all appropriate security precautions to protect the American people. Our military at home and around the world is on high alert status, and we have taken the necessary security precautions to continue the functions of your government. We have been in touch with the leaders of Congress and with world leaders to assure them that we will do whatever is necessary to protect America and Americans. I ask the American people to join me in saying a thanks for all the folks who have been fighting hard to rescue our fellow citizens, and to join me in saying a prayer for the victims and their families. The resolve of our great nation is being tested. But make no mistake, we will show the world that we will pass this test. God bless.
Strong words this morning from President Bush, or this afternoon from President Bush at Barksdale Air Force Base, where Air Force One touched down after the president left Sarasota, Florida, where he'd been holding an education event earlier today. Those strong words backed up not too long ago by British Prime Minister Tony Blair, who said, "This barbarism will stand as their shame for all eternity," speaking of the people who perpetrated this act. He also went on to say, Prime Minister Blair of Britain, "This is not a battle between the United States and terrorism, but between the free world and terrorism," and that Britain will stand shoulder to shoulder with the United States. Now, shortly after President Bush made that statement, Air Force One took off from Barksdale Air Force Base destination unknown, but something curious and unusual happened just prior to Air Force One's departure. The normal, what's called tight pool that follows the president around, usually neighboring in the area between 13 and 14 people, was whittled down to 5 people. There were a number of people from the media who were left behind at Barksdale Air Force Base, which may be a suggestion that Air Force One is not headed back for Washington, because there would be no reason to leave those people if indeed it were headed back to Andrews Air Force Base, but that indeed Air Force One may be headed for another location. At this point, the president is being kept under tight wraps. No one is talking about his destination or his whereabouts, though we do understand that the vice president is still in Washington, D.C. But again, to reiterate, a change with the leadership of Congress. They have been gathered together and are being helicoptered, ferried individually out of Washington, D.C. to an undisclosed location. And again, as far as any explosion near Camp David, Dan, the Secret Service saying that they have no information about that. It doesn't appear to have happened. Dan?
Roberts, we know that Vice President Dick Cheney is in charge in the White House Situation Room with able assistance from Condoleezza Rice of the National Security Council. Do you know who is with President Bush? Who would be the expert, if you will, helping President Bush as he is in transit from Florida to Shreveport, Louisiana, and then to wherever else he's going?
Well, Dan, when the president left for this trip to Florida, it really was more of a political and an issues trip. So he took his top advisors. Karl Rove is with him. Karen Hughes is with him, as are many of his top political and issue advisors. General Powell was in South America. He is headed back to Washington. Condoleezza Rice stayed here. I do not know if Stephen Hadley, who is the Deputy National Security Advisor, might have been traveling with the president. But Dan, as it was just a quick overnight to Florida, there's no reason for Mr. Hadley to be there. So it may be that the president does not have one of his senior national security staff with him. There's probably a minor staff member, but certainly, Dan, they are doing everything they possibly can to hustle out to the president all of the expertise that he would need. But certainly, Dan, his closest cadre of advisors have been with him since he left on Monday afternoon.
Our White House correspondent John Roberts in Washington. We go to Scott Pelley in downtown on the tip of Manhattan, where the Twin Towers collapsed. Scott?
Dan, I'm just a block from one of the World Trade Center buildings. There's another large building that's a short distance from where the aircraft impacted. It is burning above me now. There are flames shooting out of several stories of this building. Firefighters have told us there is some concern that the building might collapse because apparently the opposite face of the building has been blown away. There is towering black smoke, as you've seen from your live cameras, still rising over the tip of Manhattan. I just spoke a moment ago with some firefighters from the 3rd Aviation Battalion out of the Bronx. They told me they got here right after the first airplane impacted. They were getting their tools off their truck when the building began to collapse, and they described diving into a subway station and hearing all of the World Trade Center tower falling all around them. Apparently their tools are still buried under the rubble, and one of the firefighters said that if the subway station had not been right there, they would certainly all be dead. They also described from the center of this scene a New York City police lieutenant who was telling them to be careful to get back, and as he was waving his arms in the air, a piece of debris apparently fell from the World Trade Center building and severely wounded this officer who was trying to help the firefighters stay safe. Dan, I'm at the corner of West Broadway and Murray Street, and it is an unbelievable scene here. There are huge drips of paper. This is all the office paper that was so carefully filed in all the hundreds and hundreds of offices in the World Trade Center. It's now scattered everywhere, drifting around like snow. I've seen letters from law schools. I've seen Christmas cards, all kinds of correspondence from what were all the neat, orderly offices and orderly lives in the World Trade Center now blowing around the street here in Lower Manhattan. And finally, couldn't help but notice for the last several hours, there have been several flights of U.S. Air Force F-15 fighter planes flying overhead. One might presume that they are flying combat air patrol over Manhattan to make sure that no other unauthorized aircraft get anywhere close to here, flying combat air patrol over the soil of the United States. Dan?
Scott Pelley in Lower Manhattan. Rocky Pasafaro is a chauffeur who was waiting for a client at Broadway and Chambers here in New York City, about a half-mile from the World Trade Center buildings. Mr. Pasafaro, you saw one of the planes do what?
Well, you know, I was outside my car reading the paper, and two women walked by me, and they looked up and they says, "Look at that!" And as soon as I looked up, the plane entered the first building with the antenna, and just blew up in tremendous explosion and paper and smoke and everything, and it was just like chaos. And then, like 15 minutes later, I see the other plane coming northbound, hit the South Tower, and a big ball of flame. Everything was blown all over the place. It was terrible. I spent a lot of time in Nam, and I seen a lot of action, and this was scary. I seen people jumping off the buildings. I seen people getting, they were running out in the streets, getting hit by cars. It was just ugly. It was just terrible.
Terrible indeed. Did you get a look? You said you saw first one plane. Did you get a look at that plane?
Yeah, it looked like a big passenger liner, yeah.
Well, American Airlines says it was one of their passenger airlines that hijacked. Did you get a look at the second plane?
Yeah, it looked like a small jet, double engine maybe, you know, one of those corporate jets, I guess, and it looked like that. It hit so fast.
American Airlines says it was another one of their commercial jets, but a smaller jet.
Version, yeah.
Now, tell us about, in the case of the first plane, about how high up on that tower did it hit?
It hit at least anywhere between 20 to 25 stories below the top.
So it's a 110-story building, so you'd
say
about
90, maybe
85, 90 stories?
And it made a gigantic hole.
And the second plane?
Hit a lot lower, like in midsection of the building, like around floor 50, 60, around there.
Now, as terrible as it is, you said that you saw some people jump from the buildings.
I thought it was debris, but you've seen people jumping off that building. It was ugly. It was terrible. I've seen a lot of things in my lifetime, but I just can't imagine jumping off a building 110 stories high. I mean, it was terrible. I mean, it was just chaos everywhere. The explosion, the floors were shaking. I mean, that second plane that hit, it was a ball of flames, no exaggeration, 150 by 200 each way. That's how big it was. It was rocking, debris everywhere.
The ground shook?
Yeah, I got stuff all over my car too.
Was there a great rumble, or was it just one huge boom?
Yeah, one big boom.
That was the first plane?
The first one was, yeah, it had a loud sound. I thought it went inside the building. I thought it looked like it was gonna hit the building, then like fall down. Didn't. It went right through, it looked like a rocket. Went right through the building. Then it exploded inside, and there was debris, paper, smoke. It was just ugly.
Rocky Pasafaro, thank you for coming in. We appreciate it.
Yes, sir.
We go to Washington and Jim Stewart. Jim?
Dan, federal authorities are beginning to piece together a timeline which will assist them in their investigation, but quite frankly, at this point, don't answer as many questions as they raise. Let me run through with you what they report to be the sequence of events. The first explosion took place at 8:48 a.m., and this was the American Airlines Flight 11 from Boston to Los Angeles. It crashed into the World Trade Center. At 9:04, the picture that we have seen now many times is the United Flight 175, also from Boston to Los Angeles, it too crashing into the World Trade Center, the second tower. The next explosion occurred at 9:38. That was in Washington, D.C., and involved American Airlines Flight 77, which was traveling from Dulles International Airport in Washington to Los Angeles. That plane crashed into the Pentagon. The fourth plane remains the big mystery. That was United Flight 93, Dan, which was departing Newark for San Francisco. It did not crash until a full hour after the Pentagon explosion. It went down at 10:20 a.m., according to the FBI, in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And the sequence of events there was that this flight abruptly changed course en route from Newark to San Francisco, somewhere over Pennsylvania, and headed directly toward the Washington, D.C. area. According to senior officials who were in the command centers at FBI headquarters, there was literally a moment of great panic. They anticipated that this aircraft was headed toward the Washington area. The FAA informed the FBI that the flight path of that aircraft would take it over Camp David. An attempt was made, we are told, to communicate with that aircraft, and there was no response. Now, we are also told that there was a response. There was some sort of communication with the other aircraft, so that part of this mystery is unclear, but apparently someone on these aircraft did communicate back to the ground. Whether it was the pilots signaling distress or whether it was the people who had hijacked them is not known at this time. But the confusion over the Camp David is clearly that. This aircraft, United Aircraft Flight 93 from Newark to San Francisco, changed course abruptly and was on a flight path that was taking it over Camp David, headed directly toward the Washington area, when it mysteriously crashed. What caused that crash is entirely unclear at this point. Finally, intelligence officials say officially that they are attributing this, that has the, quote, signature of al-Qaeda, which is the terrorist organization belonging to Osama bin Laden, but they go on to say, and I quote, "It is our leading theory, but it is only that. It is a theory. It has his signature. It fits with his past pattern of terrorist events against the United States." Dan?
Jim Stewart in Washington. The Federal Aviation Agency, the FAA, confirms now that all U.S. domestic flights have landed safely. Airports around the country, as they were directed to do, have shut down, some for the first time in their history. This is obviously an unprecedented situation, the situation being many people, how many we do not know, but many people have lost their lives in the collapse of the World Trade Centers here in New York after each of the Trade Center buildings, 110 stories high, was hit by an aircraft. There have been fatalities at the Pentagon when a plane was crashed into the U.S. Defense Department there. And in this situation, there's much that is known already, but there's so much more that is unknown. The Walt Disney Company has shut down its U.S. parks and has begun what it calls assessing global operations. Disneyland in Tokyo and Paris are still open. It's this kind of thing that a lot of corporations are going to have to be making some decisions as the hours go by here. The Emmy Awards scheduled for Sunday have been canceled. Pope John Paul II condemned what he called the unspeakable horror of today's inhumane terrorist attacks, unquote, the Pope. Now, President Bush has spoken twice today, once in just after the first attacks became clear on the World Trade Centers. He was in Florida doing some work there with school children. Also, we mentioned earlier his brother's in a gubernatorial re-election situation there. The president was on a domestic trip to Florida. He spoke there, said he was going back to Washington, but he didn't. He was next reported at Barksdale Air Force Base outside Shreveport, Louisiana. There he made a videotape, somewhat more extensive statement, the president saying, one, that these were in effect cowardly acts and that they would at least eventually be punished. That was the essence of his remarks. He also called for calm and for the American people to know that their government was continuing to work, continuing to operate. All this is a paraphrase of the president, and the president on both occasions asked for the prayers of those families most directly affected by the death and destruction wrought today. Now, the situation at the moment is here in New York, hospitals are absolutely overwhelmed. Keep in mind how many hospitals there are in New York. The mayor told us, I think it's something like 150 or 60 hospitals. But the hospital situation is being stabilized now. Obviously, in the early going, they had to triage out, triage meaning, make decisions on who gets immediate treatment and who does not. The situation in the hospitals is, what last report was beginning to stabilize some because there is so much hospital help available in New York and in the surrounding areas. Some of the casualties were taken to hospitals outside New York into the suburban areas. Some elements of the National Guard have been called into service in New York to back up New York's outstanding police and fire departments. The police and fire departments here, of course, in this large city being very large, some 40,000 plus police when you count the transit police available here, very large fire department, but no city anywhere in the world could count only on its own resources when attacked in this way. Now, police say no one is going to the World Trade Center until the fire is out, and the fire is definitely not out. There are people believed trapped inside the debris of the now totally collapsed World Trade Centers. Both of the World Trade Centers have collapsed. Mayor Rudolph Giuliani told us in our CBS News interview that some of the people bound to have been trapped. Others leaped from the building in terror, in effect forced out by the fire and explosions. And one pauses almost every time you see these scenes, because if you didn't know that this was real and this videotape was taken as it happened, and you see some debris and in some cases people coming down the side of the building, you would say it must be from a horror movie. It is horrible. It is not a movie. John Serra, forgive me, is on the telephone. He was on the 47th floor of one of the World Trade Center buildings when the plane hit. Mr. Serra, thank you for being with us. What was it like?
It was very scary. We thought it was a bomb at first. The whole building shook. I was in #1 World Trade Center, 47th floor, and I work in securities area. And first we thought it was a bomb. Then we all ran towards the main door away from the windows, and we saw debris flying out outside and everything. And then out in the hallways there was a lot of smoke. So we stayed in the office. We didn't go out into the hallway. We tried to get in touch with people to find out what was going on. Someone's relative called and said that it was on CNN that a plane had crashed into the building. And another person I work with called and spoke to a friend she knew down in security, and he confirmed that, and they told us to stay put, not to leave yet. A few minutes later, we were told it was okay to start going down the stairs, and it was about 45 of us. We waited till everybody got out, and then we started down the stairs, and there was not that much smoke in the stairways, and we all had wet rags and kept it in front of our face. And when we got out into the stairs, people were coming down from the 70th and 80th floors, and later on we saw some injured people. People would yell down, "Stay to your right," and people that had burns and some were cut up or whatever. We went down first, and also some pregnant women shut down. Everybody was very helpful and orderly in the stairs, and then we started seeing firemen after we got down to the, I think, third. Firemen were coming up, walking up, carrying equipment, and at one floor, people were passing out bottles of water from a water machine, so we could, pour the water on our heads and keep the rags wet. And the smoke was not that bad, We were able to get down slowly, and I think it was 10 o'clock when I got out of the building, and that's when some debris fell down, and I was across the street, and we ran down into like a subway entrance. At that point, I became covered with the soot and the ash and everything. And then I just walked up north as far as I could, up Broadway. My sister works at Spring Street in the Village, and I went to her office. She wasn't at work, but the people in the office helped me clean up, and then I walked across the Williamsburg Bridge and came to my sister's house in Greenpoint. And I was able to contact my wife and children, let them know I was okay, and friends. It was horrible. It was unbelievable. I cannot fathom that the buildings collapsed.
John Serra.
Yes.
Eyewitness who was on the 47th floor of one of the World Trade Center buildings. Thank you.
Thank you.
For your moving eyewitness account. We go to Los Angeles. Brian Jenkins of the RAND Corporation, one of the world's ranking experts on terrorism. Mr. Jenkins, thank you for being with us. This is unprecedented today. Give us some context for it.
It is unprecedented in terms of the enormity of scale of this attack. It has long been feared by those who analyze terrorism, who look at these things, that we could see a major attack on U.S. soil. And certainly there have been many scenarios that have been tested in the various exercises that have been conducted in cities across the United States. But there is nothing in the exercises that prepares you for the stunning images that we have seen today that will take us years to digest.
Mr. Jenkins, there's never been a similar occasion, but on other occasions there's been a lot of conclusion jumping, and a lot of the conclusion jumping has been wrong. Now, there is a sort of center of gravity building around the belief that this is the work somehow, some way, of Osama bin Laden and his organization. Give us some perspective on that.
Certainly, the Osama bin Laden organization would have to be included in any short list of suspects, but it is really too early to jump to any conclusions. Keep in mind that it has been less than 6 hours since the first attack. Now, clearly, in terms of the enormity of the attack, the kind of an organization that would be required, the resources that would be required to carry this out, the style of the attack, that is consistent with some of the modus operandi that we've seen come out of the Middle East in the past. But let's wait for the evidence to take us to the conclusion as to who is responsible. Right now we know